some of you know, maybe not all of you know, I'm an attorney. I was in the Kent County Prosecutor's Office for 8 years, and so I have a long background in criminal justice, and I've actually been working in restorative justice for 25 years now. And I've taught on this, I've lectured, I've taught at colleges on it. I was a headliner of a conference that some representatives came to back in 2010 on the subject that the U of M put on. And my experiences of this, I worked on restorative justice in the criminal context with a pilot program in the Grand Rapids courts, but then I joined the Grand Rapids School Board in 2012, and my immediate concern was that we try to use restorative, and we started using the word practices, because when you talk about restorative justice, it inherently sounds adversarial, and one of the real advantages of using restorative practices in schools is the hope that you can break down this dynamic of you get a misbehaving child and all of a sudden the parent's like, you know, not my child, and my child's wonderful, and why are you picking on my child? And so restorative practice is an attempt to break down sort of an us versus them and school versus the family dynamic. And so we moved away from the word justice to the word practices in implementation in Grand Rapids. But my urgency then was that we implement restorative practices in Grand Rapids. And we started that a couple years ago, so we're in our second year really of rollout and not even in full implementation. So I do certainly want to give a shout out to Lansing. Lansing was one of the places I took our school system back in, I think, maybe 2012, 13-ish to look, because Lansing had already started and was further along the restorative practices path than we were. So that's my experience, and I've been working on this and working towards this in a lot of contexts for a long time, studying it, talking about it, lecturing on it. So a couple comments. First, Representative Tedder, I certainly hear your concern about victims, and Representative Hooker, I hear it too. Now, just to talk through your hypothetical a second, Representative Hooker, the question of, well, what if somebody was coerced into doing restorative practices? Well, you could, that same bully could say, well, why don't you, if you didn't use it, if you were using a traditional school hearing system, that bully could still find that kid and say, why don't you come to the hearing and say I didn't hit you, right? So victim intimidation is a problem no matter what kind of system you use to address conflict, right? Certainly it's something that's not going to magically go away if you use restorative practices. And the one thing that I think is worth emphasizing, Representative Tedder, restorative justice advocates will tell you that the real key to this whole process is victim-centric approaches. The most important person in any conflict is the victim. And one of the reasons why I think that restorative practices is so compelling and important is because, let's say your child gets punched in school. Well, if you put the bully out for 10 days and you bring the bully back, you haven't really solved anything, right? The kid's still there, the dynamic's still there. All of the things that led into that conflict really haven't been resolved. So putting someone out of the conflict situation temporarily can give you cool down benefits, but it doesn't really solve the underlying conflict. And there's two real problems with that. One is complexity, and I want to talk about my example of a kid that I worked with on this a little bit, because it's a good example of complexity. The other thing is, if you listen to victims, a very clear, and this is true in the criminal justice context certainly too, there's a lot of data out there. If you listen to victims and you ask them what they want in a situation where they've been harmed, the first thing they want is they want answers. They want to know why this happened. The second thing they want is they want to tell their hurt. They want to explain to the person that hurt them how much it hurt. The third thing they want is a sincere apology. The fourth thing they want is restitution. And usually the fifth thing they want is punishment. So if you're looking to actually give victims the things they want, those first three things really roll through an encounter with the offender, because the offender is the one that hurt them. That's who the victim wants to tell their hurt to. The offender is the person who knows why they did it, and the offender is the person you want an apology from. So a system where you take that offender and just put them out of the school district doesn't really give the victim tools to heal. And so restorative justice practitioners will tell you, whatever happens to the offender is almost secondary. The most important thing to work on is healing for the victim, because they didn't choose it. Victims don't choose to be bullied. They don't choose to be assaulted. And that's certainly true of teachers. I mean, if you're talking about a teacher as a victim, putting that kid out doesn't give that teacher any closure, and then the kid comes back into their classroom after whatever period the system's decided to put them out for. Doesn't solve the fact that maybe that big high school kid pushed that teacher around and the teacher's still scared. So it's really important to think of this from the victim's perspective. And the other part that Representative Shore emphasized was, this is not universal. It's not going to work in every situation. It's not going to work where a victim's so scared they don't want to see the offender. I've been a victim of 3 felony level crimes myself. One of those, someone broke into my house with a gun, and someone asked, would I like to sit down and have an encounter with the offender? No, I was scared of that offender, and I said no, and that was the end of it. So a properly run restorative practices system listens to victims, and if the victims don't want to participate with the offender, they don't get to. Then you go through a traditional expulsion, suspension matrix for how you deal with a crime. What this is it's a tool to allow you to get to healing, to allow you to have that community function better, and to try to keep kids in, and to try to keep schools functioning the way we want them to function. So in Grand Rapids, the first year we implemented this, we dropped suspensions district-wide 25%. We dropped suspensions for African American males with IEPs, and that gets to Representative Chang's question, by 40%. This year, our second year in, we've had double-digit reductions again. We've reduced our time lost to suspensions 26% in the district. In other words, kids are in the classroom more and they're learning. This is something that's snowballing. We started doing this with 4 schools, and all the other schools in the district started saying, why can't we do this? Why can't we do this? Principals started using restorative practices meetings when they were dealing with teachers. They started having circle meetings with teachers spontaneously because, sometimes administration doesn't get along with teachers. And so this conflict resolution model has really been adopted in Grand Rapids with terrific results. Now, I know I've been testifying for a while, and you can stop me if you need to.
Well, I do want to ask a question with your background in criminal justice. And I apologize for my lack of knowledge on this, but how did the zero tolerance policy come into being in the first place? And we heard a little bit from Joe Ellen, and then, and are there crimes or incidents that are just non-excusable whatsoever?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think that zero tolerance is sort of an attempt to use an axe rather than a scalpel. And Representative Hooker and Representative Shore both have examples of bad applications, right? Where you say no weapon, and then a weapon turns out to be a butter knife, when really what we meant was we don't want gang members bringing 9mm to school, right? Now, no school district in their right mind is going to not suspend a child that brings a gun to school, right? So this doesn't stop suspensions and expulsions for situations where you look at them and you think, this is scary. And frankly, I think it was Representative Lyons' bill says we've got to have reporting out of incidents that are serious enough. If these are things that warrant law enforcement intervention, we want to have law enforcement intervention. If this is a child that's doing something dangerous enough that they ought to be in the juvenile detention system, let's do that. But one thing that's worth pointing out, Representative Price, is I'm not all that concerned or interested in, and I say this, I mean, maybe Representative Shore is going to be annoyed with me, but I'm not all that concerned about the zero tolerance phenomena, and here's why. It's the tip of the iceberg. In Grand Rapids, when I got on the school board, there were over 3,000 children every year in a 17,000 child district who were being suspended. There were 300 to 400 children every year who were being given long-term suspensions, which is sort of a bureaucratic way of expelling children without admitting it. You give them a 180-day suspension, which is an entire school year. Of course they leave, right? So we had hundreds of children we were expelling functionally, thousands of children we were suspending, and 2 or 3 of them would get tripped up by the zero tolerance laws. So I think the zero tolerance laws are a bad idea because they stop you having discretion and they result in these irrational results, but those are anecdotal. In Grand Rapids, I was dealing with a system and a school board that had thousands of children who were being put out into the community, essentially. And June Cleaver is not waiting at home for these children. In my district, 90% of my children qualify for free or reduced lunch. What that means is I've got a district that's largely defined by poverty. And well, there was some discussion about whether or not we want to not expel children for not showing up. I think it's critical when you look at this law it says you don't want to expel those children only for not showing up. So if you do an investigation and you find out the kid's not showing up because they're refusing to show up, well, then you can suspend them or expel them. But in one of my high schools in Grand Rapids, 30% of the children in that high school at Union live at more than one address in the course of any given school year. These kids move around a lot. They get evicted. Their parents get kicked out of their apartments, and so the kids don't go to school. So I guess I hope, and I'm sure the intent of the bill was to say, if a kid doesn't show up, let's do a little analysis and figure out why they're not showing up. If they're not showing up because they're not showing up of their own volition, well, sure, then kick them out. But if they're not showing up because their parents got evicted and they're living under a bridge and then you ought to at least take a look at that, because certainly in districts of poverty, that's a big issue. So in my district, we had thousands of kids who were being sent home to empty houses. Now, if you send an 8-year-old home to an empty house, that's immoral. If you send a 15-year-old home to an empty house, that's foolish. I know what I would have done when I was 15 if you had sent me home for 10 days with nothing to do and no parents around, right? So if you send 15-year-old kids home to empty houses, guess what? They go out in the community, they have some kind of contact with law enforcement, and they're on their first step to Jackson. So keeping kids in the classroom is critical. And so as much as I don't like zero tolerance laws, the real concern for me is the question of how do we drive down suspensions and expulsions. And in Grand Rapids, our experience has been double-digit reductions in those numbers year over year, and district after district is going to be able to come up and tell you the same thing. Now, if I could, if you're running out of time, I understand, but
we do have to vote real quickly because we're going to lose members.
Right.
Although we just lost a member, and I gained one. 2 members. Oh goodness. Well, just go very quickly. One more comment, and then we'll try to round up folks and we'll move on. But
if I can just give you one last example. I represented a child once. His name was Michael. He was a 16-year-old. His daily experience in school is that he was told he was fat, he was ugly, and he was poor. After years of this, Michael went into a bathroom stall and wrote on the bathroom stall, "You all must die." Michael got suspended and charged with a 20-year terrorism felony. Now, if you look at Michael's case, the question is he the victim or is he an offender? Well, he's really both, right? So what I did with Michael was I went out and I brought him to the children in that school community, and he apologized to group after group after group of them for putting them in fear by writing that on the bathroom wall. What happened was, in group after group after group, some of those children apologized to Michael for bullying him. And the result was he was able to stay in that community, he was reconciled with it, and he actually wound up with friends in a district in which he had been ostracized in the beginning. So working through the complexity of bullying with encounters between the people who are actually involved in the dynamics can really change kids' lives. Thanks.
thank you.